The city with two names. What if an entire city hid for centuries not underwater, but inside the confusion over its own name? The ancient Greeks called it Heracleion, named after the hero Heracles, who according to legend first set foot on Egyptian soil right there. The Egyptians called the very same city something else, Thonis. Two different peoples, two different languages, two different names for one and the same place. And for nearly 2,000 years, historians were certain that two names meant two different cities. They were wrong, but to understand just how wrong, someone had to dive 6.5 kilometers off the coast of modern Alexandria. Once, this had been Egypt's largest port on the Mediterranean, the main gateway through which ships from the Greek world entered the country. Long before Alexander the Great founded Alexandria, just a few kilometers away, this city greeted traders, soldiers, and travelers arriving from across the known world. A massive temple stood here, dedicated to the god Amun, the supreme deity of the Egyptian pantheon. Pharaohs came here to receive divine blessing for their rule, passing through a ritual that bound the earthly king to the will of the gods. Knowledge of the city survived only in fragments. A handful of inscriptions carved in stone. A few lines from ancient Greek writers, Herodotus, Strabo, Diodorus. Herodotus, who visited Egypt in the 5th century BCE, wrote of a temple built where the hero Heracles first entered this land. He also claimed something even stranger, that Helen of Troy and her lover Paris had stopped in this very city on their way toward the war that would become known as the Trojan War. Centuries after Herodotus, another ancient writer, Strabo, pinned down the city's location more precisely, placing it directly east of Canopus, at the mouth of one of the Nile's branches. Whether this was truth or a beautiful legend that had grown attached to the city's name, no one could check. Because the place itself seemed to no longer exist, no ruins on land, no clear traces on any map. Just a name drifting from one ancient text to another, slowly turning into something halfway between history and fairy tale. Century after century, the city was treated as myth, a kind of younger sibling to Atlantis, a story too beautiful to be true and too vague to search for seriously. When scholars mentioned it at all, they did so with an obligatory qualifier. According to legend, if the ancient sources are to be believed, supposedly. That continued until the year 2000, when French researcher Franck Goddio and his team, after years of searching in Aboukir Bay, watched a colossal stone face emerge from the underwater darkness. By that point, Goddio was already known as one of the pioneers of modern marine archaeology. He had founded the European Institute for Underwater Archaeology back in 1987, and had spent the years since developing a method that set his work apart from simple, random searching. His team combed the seafloor in parallel lines at regular intervals, flagging any anomalies in the terrain, which divers or underwater robots would then investigate. It was exactly this systematic, almost engineering-like approach that eventually led him to a discovery centuries of searches had considered impossible. The city had been found, completely submerged 6.5 kilometers from the modern coast of Alexandria, far further from shore than anyone had thought to look. What came up from the seabed over the following years stunned even the archaeologists themselves. 64 ancient ships resting on the ocean floor, an entire frozen fleet, preserved in sill for 1,000 years, 700 anchors, hordes of gold coins, statues several meters tall, carved from granite and diorite, stone so hard that modern tools struggled to shape it, while ancient craftsmen had done it without any machinery at all, using nothing but patience and generations of manual labor. The remains of that very temple dedicated to Amun, and tiny sarcophagi, not for people, but for animals offered as sacred sacrifices to the god. But the most unexpected discovery wasn't waiting in the water, it was waiting in the archives. As they studied the recovered artifacts and inscriptions, Goddio's team began noticing something strange. The name Thonis, found on some tablets, and the name Heracleion, found on others, referred to the exact same place, the exact same city. The Egyptians had simply called it one thing, the Greeks another, and for 2,000 years, not a single historian had connected these two names to each other. continuing instead to search for two separate lost cities where in reality only one had ever existed. The city everyone believed to be two different cities had been one the entire time. It hadn't just hidden beneath the water, it had hidden behind its own naming, confusion, behind the fact that two civilizations trading with each other in its very streets, each described it in their own language, and those descriptions drifted apart into different libraries, different eras, different scholarly traditions that existed in parallel for centuries without ever crossing paths. So what sank it? The answer turned out to be less romantic than legends of gods and heroes, but no less dramatic. A series of earthquakes, followed by tidal waves, triggered something called soil liquefaction, where waterlogged ground literally loses its solidity and starts behaving like liquid under the weight of everything built on top of it. Huge sections of the Nile Delta, including the ground the city stood on, began slowly sinking into the sea. Not in a single day, the way some other legends of sunken cities describe it, but gradually over centuries, until by the 8th century CE the city had vanished completely, leaving behind nothing but a name split across two languages. The work underwater hasn't stopped, even today. Just a few years ago, Goddio's team, working alongside Egypt's Department of Underwater Archaeology, uncovered massive new stone blocks, collapsed sections of that same Temple of Amun, the very place where, according to tradition, pharaohs received their power from the hands of the gods. Nearby, they also found artifacts from a Greek sanctuary dedicated to Aphrodite, another reminder of just how mixed, how multinational life had been in this port at the crossroads of cultures, where Egyptian priests and Greek merchants coexisted side by side for centuries. In 2015, the British Museum and Goddio's team organized the first underwater archaeological exhibition, showing the public more than 200 artifacts recovered from the seabed over the preceding years. People seeing these finds in person for the first time looked into the faces of statues that had last seen sunlight 1,200 years earlier. 1,200 years underwater. That's longer than many modern nations have existed. Longer than the time since half the buildings we call ancient today were even constructed. It's worth pausing to consider how many generations of researchers searched for Heracleion and Thonis as two separate independent projects. 19th century mapmakers drew hypothetical charts, trying to place both cities somewhere along the coastline, never realizing they were sketching the very same location twice under two different labels. Archaeologists working on land in the early 20th century dug for the ruins of Thonis in one district, while classical philologists argued over the precise location of Heracleion based on entirely different texts, and both groups were, in effect, searching for the same lost city from opposite sides of the very same confusion. And the whole time, the city wasn't waiting beneath layers of anonymous silt and ruin. It was waiting behind its own shadow, behind a simple historical misunderstanding nobody had bothered to untangle, because untangling it required not diving underwater, but carefully comparing two texts written in two different languages. There's something particularly unsettling about that. Not that the city was lost. That has happened to plenty of civilizations, from Dwarka to dozens of lesser-known places around the world. But that this particular city was lost, not from a lack of evidence, but from an excess of contradictory evidence that no one had ever cross-referenced. The key to the mystery wasn't lying on the ocean floor. It was sitting in the archives, in texts people had read for centuries, without ever reading them closely enough to notice the obvious overlap. How many other places like this exist right now? Not lost because records of them don't exist, but lost because those records are scattered, split across different names, different languages, different archives that no one has ever put side by side. How many cities, mountains, rivers, or entire civilizations are hiding not in the darkness of the unknown, but in plain sight under two different names in two different catalogs that nobody has bothered to open at the same time? Maybe it isn't always about finding something new. Maybe sometimes it's enough to look at what's already known from a different angle and see that two different names had been pointing at the same place, the same story, told twice in two different voices, the entire time. A similar thing has happened elsewhere in the ancient world, incidentally. The same settlement sometimes surfaces in the sources under a Roman name, a local name, and a later name. And only centuries afterward do researchers realize they weren't untangling separate mysteries at all. Just one mystery, split into pieces by a language barrier. In that sense, Heracleion isn't an exception. It might just be the clearest, best documented example of how easily human history loses track of itself, not through disaster, but through its own multilingual nature. Heracleion is no longer a myth, but how many other stories divided between libraries and languages are still waiting for someone to finally notice they've been telling the same story all along?